The notification from UBS Geneva arrived at 3:47 a.m. Seattle time, marked urgent and confidential. I stared at my phone screen in the darkness of my cramped Capitol Hill studio apartment, the blue light casting shadows across the stack of overdue bills on my nightstand. The subject line read simply, "A state disclosure, Whitman Trust Holdings, immediate action required." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, David Chen had stood before a packed auditorium at the Seattle Tech Innovation Center, his polished smile gleaming under the stage lights as he delivered what would become the most humiliating moment of my professional life. The moderator had just asked about emerging competitors in the software development space when David's eyes found mine in the crowd. His response was calculated, devastating, and delivered with surgical precision. "Well, there are always people who claim to be building something significant," he said, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. Take Sarah Mitchell, for instance. She talks about innovation and disruption, makes grand promises about her so-called empire, but when you look beneath the surface, when you examine the actual financials, the real infrastructure. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Let's just say some wealth is more authentic than others. The audience shifted in their seats. Phones came out. Within minutes, clips of his remarks were spreading across LinkedIn, Twitter, and every tech blog that mattered. By evening, the narrative was set in stone. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who claimed to run a cutting-edge tech company, was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, a fraud. Someone whose supposed success was built on lies and empty promises. The morning after David's public assassination of my reputation dawned gray and relentless, typical Seattle weather that seemed to match my mood perfectly. I sat in my apartment, watching raindrops race down the single window that faced the brick wall of the building next door, my laptop open to a screen full of notifications I couldn't bring myself to read. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, former clients, and investors, but I let them all go to voicemail. What was the point? David Chen had done what he set out to do. In less than 5 minutes on a conference stage, he had reduced 5 years of my work to a punchline. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, Mitchell Innovations had been riding high. We were a boutique software development firm specializing in financial security systems, the kind of behind-the-scenes technology that made banking safer and more efficient. Our client list included 3 major credit unions and a handful of smaller investment firms. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would land us on magazine covers, but solid, profitable work that paid the bills and then some. I had deliberately kept our profile low, preferring to let our results speak for themselves rather than chasing headlines and venture capital funding. That conservative approach had served us well for years, but it also left us vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack David had launched. When people don't see flashy offices or constant media coverage, when you don't throw launch parties or hire PR firms to trumpet your every move, it becomes easy for someone to suggest that maybe there's nothing substantial underneath. Maybe you're just pretending to be successful while living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment, scraping by on hope and borrowed time. The truth was more complicated. But David knew I couldn't explain it publicly without revealing things I wasn't ready to reveal. Mitchell Innovations operated differently than most tech companies, because it had been designed that way from the beginning, built on principles that Robert Whitman had taught me during the 3 years I worked as his research assistant at the University of Washington's Computer Science Department. Robert had been more than just my mentor. He was the closest thing to a father figure I'd had since losing my parents in a car accident when I was 19. Robert Whitman was old school in the best possible way. He believed that real innovation happened quietly, in small teams working on problems that mattered rather than problems that generated buzz. He taught me to value substance over style, long-term thinking over quick wins, and most importantly, to never let anyone else define what success looked like for me. When I started Mitchell Innovations 5 years ago, I built it according to his principles: lean operations, careful client selection, and a focus on creating tools that would still be valuable decades from now. The problem with that approach, as I was learning in the most painful way possible, was that it left you exposed to people like David Chen, who understood that perception often mattered more than reality in the modern business world. David had built his company Chen Digital Solutions using a completely different playbook. Flashy presentations, aggressive marketing, venture capital funding, and a downtown Bellevue office space that probably cost more per month than I made in a quarter. He positioned himself as the face of Seattle's tech scene, always available for interviews, always ready with a quotable soundbite about disruption and innovation. Our paths had crossed 3 years ago when we were both bidding on a contract with Pacific Northwest Credit Union. They needed a complete overhaul of their online banking security system, the kind of complex, unglamorous work that Mitchell Innovations specialized in. David's proposal was slick and expensive, full of buzzwords and promises about revolutionary approaches to financial technology. My proposal was half the cost and twice as detailed, outlining exactly how we would solve each specific security vulnerability the credit union faced. I got the contract, and David never forgot it. Over the next 3 years, we found ourselves competing for similar projects, and more often than not, my quiet, thorough approach won out over his flashier presentations. Each loss ate at him, and I could see it in the way his public comments about industry trends began to include subtle digs at companies that prioritized cost-cutting over innovation, or that confused basic competence with genuine breakthrough thinking. The attacks escalated gradually. First, it was just industry gossip, whispered conversations at networking events about whether Sarah Mitchell was really as successful as she claimed to be. Then came the more direct challenges, questions about why my company didn't have a more visible presence if we were doing such important work. Why didn't we have venture backing? Why didn't I speak at more conferences? Why was I still living in a studio apartment if my company was supposedly thriving? Those questions bothered me more than they should have, partly because I couldn't answer them honestly without explaining things I wasn't ready to explain. The truth was that Mitchell Innovations had been profitable from year 2, profitable enough that I could have moved to a bigger apartment, hired more staff, or expanded our operations. But Robert had taught me to be suspicious of rapid growth and flashy displays of wealth. He believed that the best businesses grew steadily and sustainably, reinvesting their profits rather than spending them on appearances. More importantly, Robert had left me with specific instructions about how to handle the company's finances, instructions that I followed even though I didn't fully understand them at the time. Every month I transferred 75% of our profits to a secure investment account that Robert had helped me establish.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
During his final months, he told me it was for the company's long-term stability, a way to ensure that Mitchell Innovations would never be vulnerable to economic downturns or unexpected expenses. The account was managed through a Swiss banking firm that Robert had worked with for decades, something to do with his early career in international finance before he became an academic. I received quarterly statements showing steady growth, but the balance was significant enough that I rarely paid close attention to the specific numbers. It felt like a safety net, something that would be there if I ever needed it, but not something I thought about day to day while focusing on building the business. That careful financial management meant that Mitchell Innovations always appeared smaller and more modest than it actually was. While David was spending his venture capital on premium office space and expensive marketing campaigns, I was quietly building a war chest that could have funded our operations for years without a single new client. But that conservative approach also made me an easy target for someone who understood how to weaponize appearances. The morning after David's conference attack, I forced myself to read through the coverage of his remarks. The tech blogs were having a field day with the story, turning it into a broader conversation about authenticity in the startup world. Several articles used me as an example of how easy it was to fake success in an industry where everyone exaggerated their achievements. One particularly brutal piece in GeekWire included a sidebar analyzing the warning signs that a tech company might be less successful than it appears, using Mitchell Innovations as their case study. The criticism stung, but what really bothered me were the responses from people I'd considered friends and allies in the industry. Former clients began distancing themselves, worried about being associated with someone whose reputation was suddenly in question. A partnership deal I'd been negotiating fell through when the other company decided they needed to reassess their strategic priorities. 3 of my 5 employees asked for meetings to discuss the current situation, and I could see the doubt in their eyes even as they assured me of their continued loyalty. The worst part was the silence from people who knew better. Colleagues who had worked with me for years, clients who had seen the quality of our work firsthand, potential partners who had reviewed our financials during due diligence processes. They all knew that David's insinuations were baseless, but none of them were willing to speak up publicly. In the tech world's ecosystem of reputation and relationships, being associated with someone who was under attack, even unfairly, carried its own risks. By the end of that first week, I was starting to question everything I thought I knew about building a business. Maybe Robert's advice had been outdated, more relevant to his generation than to mine. Maybe David was right that appearances mattered more than substance in the modern economy. Maybe I should have been more aggressive about self-promotion, more willing to play the games that everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. Those doubts were eating away at me when I received the call from Elena Rodriguez, an attorney with Rothschild and Associates in Geneva. She explained that she had been retained by UBS to handle certain matters related to the Whitman Trust, and that she needed to speak with me urgently about developments that could affect my business interests. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore, coming just as my professional world was collapsing around me. Elena's voice carried the kind of crisp professionalism that comes from years of handling high-stakes international finance, but there was something else underneath it, a hint of excitement that suggested she was dealing with something unusual. She couldn't discuss the details over the phone, she explained, but she could arrange for me to fly to Geneva within the next few days for a confidential meeting that would clarify my position regarding certain investment holdings that had been managed on my behalf. I almost declined. Flying to Switzerland seemed like an expensive distraction from the crisis I was facing in Seattle, and I wasn't sure I could afford to be away from the office while trying to salvage what remained of my reputation. But something about Elena's tone, the way she emphasized that this matter was both urgent and potentially significant for my future business operations, convinced me to at least hear her out. The flight to Geneva gave me 12 hours to think about how dramatically my life had changed in just 1 week. A month earlier, I had been running a successful company, living quietly but comfortably, focused on the work I loved, and the clients who valued what we delivered. Now I was heading to a meeting with Swiss bankers about investments I barely remembered making, hoping against hope that somehow, Robert Whitman's mysterious financial arrangements might offer a way forward. I had no idea that I was about to discover that everything I thought I knew about my mentor, my company, and my own financial situation was about to be turned completely upside down. The modest investment account I had been contributing to for years was actually just the tip of an iceberg, a small visible portion of a financial empire that Robert had been building for decades, an empire that was about to become mine to command. Parts 2 Marking the 5. The deceptive calm through the mentor's legacy. 3 months before David Chen destroyed my reputation on that Seattle conference stage, everything in my world seemed perfectly aligned for the first time in years. Mitchell Innovations had just completed our largest contract to date, a comprehensive security overhaul for Cascade Financial that had taken 8 months and generated more revenue than we'd seen in our previous 2 years combined. The project had gone so smoothly that the CEO, Patricia Wong, had already started conversations about expanding our relationship to include their sister companies across the Pacific Northwest. I remember sitting in my favorite coffee shop in Capitol Hill on that crisp October morning, reviewing the final payment notification on my laptop while steam rose from my cup of Ethiopian dark roast. The deposit had cleared overnight, bringing our company account to its highest balance ever. More importantly, the client feedback had been overwhelmingly positive, with Patricia specifically noting how our security protocols had already prevented 2 attempted breaches that their previous system would have missed entirely. The success felt different from our earlier wins because of its scale and visibility within the local financial sector. Word was spreading through industry networks about the quality of our work, and I was fielding inquiries from potential clients I never would have had access to just a year earlier. One investment firm in Portland had already flown me down for a preliminary discussion about modernizing their entire technology infrastructure, a project that could potentially triple our annual revenue if we landed it. Everything seemed to be falling into place exactly as Robert had predicted during our last conversation before his death 2 years earlier. He had been adamant that slow, steady growth built on genuine expertise would eventually create opportunities that no amount of flashy marketing could match. The financial services industry, he explained, ultimately cared more about results than presentations, more about preventing disasters than generating headlines. If we could prove ourselves capable of handling sensitive, complex projects, the word would spread naturally through the networks that mattered. That prediction was proving accurate in ways that exceeded even my optimistic projections. The Cascade Financial project had showcased every strength that Mitchell Innovations possessed: our ability to understand complex legacy systems, our skill at implementing modern security protocols without disrupting daily operations, and our commitment to delivering exactly what we promised, when we promised it. More importantly, it demonstrated that we could handle the kind of high-stakes work that larger firms often botch through overconfidence or insufficient attention to detail. The morning after receiving that final payment, I found myself walking through downtown Seattle with an unusual sense of confidence about the future. For the first time since starting the company, I wasn't worried about making payroll or covering office expenses. We had enough cash flow to take on more ambitious projects, enough credibility to compete for contracts that had previously been out of reach, and enough momentum to start thinking about strategic expansion rather than just survival. I spent that day meeting with my small team to discuss how we might scale our operations to handle the increasing demand for our services. Maria Santos, my operations manager, had put together a detailed analysis of our capacity constraints and the investments we'd need to make to grow responsibly. We talked about hiring 2 additional developers, leasing a larger office space, and perhaps most significantly, beginning to market our services more aggressively to reach clients beyond the Pacific Northwest. The conversation was energizing in a way that reminded me why I'd started the company in the first place. We weren't just talking about generating more revenue or building a bigger business, we were discussing how to scale our impact, how to help more organizations protect themselves from the increasingly sophisticated threats they faced in an interconnected digital economy. The work felt meaningful, profitable, and sustainable, exactly the combination that Robert had taught me to value above all else. Even the financial arrangements he'd helped me establish were performing better than expected. The quarterly statement from the Swiss investment account showed continued steady growth, with the balance now substantial enough that I'd started to think of it as genuine financial security, rather than just an emergency fund. Robert's conservative investment strategy seemed to be paying off, providing the kind of long-term stability that would allow Mitchell Innovations to weather economic uncertainty without compromising our principles or our quality standards. Looking back, I realized that period of optimism and confidence made me vulnerable in ways I didn't recognize at the time. Success, even modest success, can create blind spots, and mine was failing to understand how my growing reputation might threaten people who saw the industry differently. I was so focused on building something sustainable and valuable that I didn't pay enough attention to the politics and positioning that shaped public perception in Seattle's competitive tech scene. David Chen, meanwhile, had been watching my progress with growing frustration. While I was quietly building a track record of successful projects and satisfied clients, his company was struggling to live up to the hype he generated through aggressive marketing and media attention. Chen Digital Solutions had raised significant venture capital based on promises about revolutionary approaches to financial technology, but their actual implementations were consistently behind schedule and over budget. The contrast between our approaches was becoming increasingly visible to potential clients who did their due diligence. Several companies that had initially been attracted to David's polished presentations ultimately chose to work with us after comparing our references and reviewing our actual track record. Each time that happened, David's public confidence seemed to crack just a little more, and his comments about industry trends became more pointed and personal. I should have recognized the warning signs, but I was too busy enjoying the satisfaction of finally seeing Robert's business philosophy validated by real-world results. The success felt earned rather than accidental, built on years of careful preparation and disciplined execution. I had followed his advice about prioritizing substance over style, long-term thinking over short-term gains, and client satisfaction over self-promotion, and all of those choices were finally paying off in tangible ways. The irony is that my commitment to staying focused on the work rather than the politics made me an easier target when David finally decided to attack. I hadn't built the kind of public profile that would have protected me from his accusations, and I hadn't cultivated the media relationships that might have provided alternative narratives when he began spreading doubt about my company's authenticity. I had been so confident in the strength of our actual performance that I underestimated how much damage could be done through strategic manipulation of perception. That overconfidence extended to my personal life as well. For the first time in years, I had started to relax about money, allowing myself to think about upgrading my living situation or taking a real vacation. I had even started looking at condos in some of Seattle's nicer neighborhoods, imagining what it might be like to have a home office with a view of the Sound rather than a workspace carved out of my studio apartment's main room. The financial security that Robert's investment strategies had provided was giving me options I'd never had before, and I was beginning to understand why he had been so insistent about the importance of building multiple revenue streams. The consulting work generated immediate cash flow, but the investment returns were creating long-term wealth that could eventually give me complete independence from client work if I chose to pursue it. Those dreams of expanded possibilities made David's eventual attack even more devastating. In the space of a few minutes on that conference stage, he managed to transform my greatest strengths into apparent weaknesses, my careful financial management into evidence of deception, and my commitment to substance into proof that I was hiding something. The reputation I had spent years building was reduced to rubble, and the bright future I had been planning suddenly seemed impossibly distant. But even in those dark moments immediately after his public assassination of my credibility, I couldn't have imagined how completely wrong both David and I were about the true nature of my financial situation. The modest investment account that I thought represented my life savings was actually just a tiny fraction of something much larger, something that Robert had been building for decades without ever fully explaining its scope or significance. Robert Whitman had been the kind of mentor every aspiring entrepreneur dreams of finding, but he was also something more complex and mysterious than I had realized during our years of working together. On the surface, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a brilliant computer science professor who had transitioned into academia after a successful early career in the private sector, someone who understood both the technical and business sides of technology development better than almost anyone I'd ever met. What I didn't know during those 3 years when I served as his research assistant was that Robert's early career in the private sector had been far more extensive and lucrative than he had ever let on. He had been one of the original architects of secure financial transaction systems back in the 1980s, working with European banks to develop the protocols that would eventually become the foundation of modern digital banking. That work had made him wealthy, but more importantly, it had given him connections and insights into international finance that he had continued to leverage for decades. Robert's approach to mentorship was characteristic of everything else he did: methodical, long-term focused, and oriented around principles that weren't immediately obvious to the people he was teaching. He never told me directly that he was wealthy, but he also never seemed concerned about money in the way that most academics were. His office was comfortable but not luxurious, his car was reliable but not expensive, and his lifestyle appeared modest and sustainable rather than flashy or indulgent. What I came to understand gradually and incompletely was that Robert saw wealth as a tool rather than an end goal. He had generated significant returns through careful investing over several decades, but he wasn't interested in the lifestyle changes that usually accompanied financial success. Instead, he was focused on using his resources to support people and projects that aligned with his values, particularly those related to developing more secure and equitable financial systems. My relationship with Robert began during my senior year at the University of Washington, when I was struggling to balance my computer science coursework with the financial pressures of supporting myself through school. My parents had died in a car accident during my sophomore year, and the life insurance settlement was enough to cover tuition but not living expenses. I was working 20 hours a week at a campus computer lab while carrying a full course load, and the stress was starting to affect my academic performance. Robert noticed my situation during his advanced cryptography seminar, a class that I was barely managing to keep up with despite being genuinely fascinated by the material. He approached me after class one day to ask if I might be interested in a research assistant position that would pay better than my lab job while providing more relevant experience for my career goals. The project involved analyzing security vulnerabilities in financial transaction systems, exactly the kind of work that I hoped to pursue professionally. Working for Robert transformed my understanding of what technology could accomplish when it was developed with clear principles and long-term thinking. He taught me to see beyond the immediate technical challenges to understand the broader implications of our work, the ways that secure financial systems could expand economic opportunities for individuals and communities that traditional banking had underserved. More importantly, he showed me how to approach complex problems with patience and systematic thinking, rather than rushing toward quick solutions. The research we conducted together during those 3 years laid the foundation for everything I would later accomplish with Mitchell Innovations. Robert's methodical approach to identifying vulnerabilities and developing countermeasures became my standard process for client projects. His emphasis on thorough documentation and transparent communication with stakeholders shaped my approach to client relationships. Most importantly, his belief that technology should serve human needs rather than corporate profits became the guiding philosophy for how I built my company. But Robert's influence extended far beyond technical training and business philosophy. He was also teaching me, without my fully realizing it, how to think about money and wealth in ways that prioritized long-term security over short-term consumption. The investment account he helped me establish was just one part of a broader financial education that emphasized patience, diversification, and the importance of building multiple income streams. He often talked about the difference between being rich and being wealthy, a distinction that I didn't fully appreciate at the time. Being rich, he explained, meant having a high income or valuable assets, but wealth was about having systems that generated ongoing returns regardless of your active involvement.
True wealth provided options and
security that couldn't be threatened by economic downturns or changes in your industry, and building it required thinking in terms of decades rather than years. During our weekly meetings, Robert would often share stories from his earlier career that illustrated these principles in action. He talked about colleagues who had made fortunes during technology booms only to lose everything when markets shifted, and others who had built sustainable wealth by focusing on consistent returns rather than spectacular gains. He emphasized the importance of understanding global financial markets, not just domestic ones, and the value of working with institutions that had proven themselves over centuries rather than companies that promised revolutionary changes. Those conversations shaped my approach to managing Mitchell Innovations' finances, but they also prepared me for opportunities I couldn't have imagined at the time. Robert was teaching me to think like someone who would eventually manage significant wealth, even though I had no idea that he was simultaneously building that wealth on my behalf through investment strategies that I was only beginning to understand. The complexity of Robert's financial arrangements became apparent only gradually, and only after his death forced me to take more direct responsibility for managing the systems he had established. The quarterly statements from the Swiss investment account showed steady growth, but they also included references to subsidiary holdings and partnership distributions that I didn't fully comprehend. When I asked the account managers for clarification, they explained that Mr. Whitman had structured the investments to provide maximum diversification and tax efficiency, but the details were handled through their institutional services division. I accepted those explanations because they seemed consistent with Robert's general approach to everything else: thorough, sophisticated, and oriented around long-term results rather than immediate understanding. I trusted his judgment about financial strategy the same way I trusted his guidance about technology development and business building. Both required specialized knowledge that took years to develop, and both produced better results when you worked with true experts rather than trying to manage everything yourself. What I didn't realize was that Robert had been preparing me not just to manage my own modest wealth, but to eventually oversee a financial empire that he had been building for decades. The investment account I thought represented my life savings was actually just the visible portion of a much larger structure, one that included real estate holdings across 3 continents, equity positions in dozens of technology companies, and partnership stakes in financial services firms that I had never heard of, but that generated millions in annual returns. All of this would become clear during my meeting with Elena Rodriguez in Geneva, but even Robert's death hadn't prepared me for the scope of what he had built, or the responsibilities that would come with inheriting it. He had spent years teaching me to think like someone who could handle significant wealth, but he had never explained that I was actually being prepared to manage resources that would make me one of the wealthiest individuals in the technology sector. The gradual revelation of Robert's true legacy would ultimately provide the means to not only defend myself against David Chen's attacks, but to demonstrate just how fundamentally wrong his assessment of my situation had been. But first, I would have to travel halfway around the world to discover that everything I thought I knew about my mentor, my finances, and my future was about to change in ways I could never have anticipated. Part 3. The devastating blow. The Seattle Tech Innovation Conference had always been the kind of event I avoided. Too much networking, too many people trying to impress each other with buzzwords and venture capital connections, too little focus on the actual work that moved the industry forward. But this year was different. Patricia Wong from Cascade Financial had specifically requested that I attend to represent our successful partnership during a panel discussion about cybersecurity innovations in the Pacific Northwest financial sector. The invitation felt like validation of everything Robert had taught me about building a reputation through results rather than self-promotion. Here was a major client, someone whose company we had genuinely helped, asking me to share our story with the broader tech community. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to let our work speak for itself, while potentially connecting with other organizations that could benefit from our expertise. I had spent weeks preparing for the panel, not because I was nervous about discussing our technical approach, but because I wanted to make sure I represented both Mitchell Innovations and Cascade Financial in a way that honored the trust Patricia had placed in me. The presentation I developed focused on specific challenges we had identified in their legacy systems and the methodical process we had used to implement modern security protocols without disrupting their daily operations. The conference venue was the Grand Hyatt Seattle, with its soaring glass atrium and panoramic views of Elliott Bay. Tech executives, startup founders, and venture capitalists filled the lobby, their conversations creating a constant buzz of ambition and competition. I recognized many faces from previous events, people who had built successful companies, raised significant funding, or achieved the kind of industry recognition that came with aggressive networking and media cultivation. David Chen was holding court near the registration area when I arrived, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers and potential investors. He was in his element, gesturing expansively as he described his company's latest product developments and their plans for international expansion. His confidence was magnetic in the way that successful salespeople learn to project, drawing people in with the promise that association with him might lead to their own success. I had deliberately scheduled my arrival to minimize social interactions, planning to attend only the sessions directly relevant to my panel presentation. But the conference organizers had arranged a networking breakfast that I couldn't avoid without seeming antisocial or unprofessional. Patricia Wong was expecting to see me there, and several potential clients had specifically requested meetings based on word-of-mouth recommendations from our existing relationships. The breakfast was held in the hotel's waterfront ballroom, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the morning light reflecting off Puget Sound. Round tables accommodated 8 people each, creating intimate conversation spaces where business cards were exchanged and partnerships were explored over coffee and pastries. I found myself seated with a mix of banking executives, software developers, and startup founders, all of whom seemed genuinely interested in learning about our approach to financial security. The conversation was flowing naturally when David appeared at our table, his smile bright and seemingly friendly as he introduced himself to the people he didn't already know. He complimented our recent work with Cascade Financial, mentioning that he had heard excellent things about the project through industry channels. His tone was warm and collegial, giving no hint of the animosity that I knew existed beneath the surface. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe we had moved beyond our professional rivalry. Perhaps David had realized that there was room for multiple successful companies in the Seattle tech ecosystem, that competition could be healthy rather than destructive. His questions about our technical approach seemed genuinely curious rather than probing for weaknesses, and his comments about the financial services industry were insightful and well-informed. That illusion lasted exactly until the moment he casually mentioned that he was scheduled to participate in a panel discussion about emerging trends in the regional tech sector. His eyes met mine across the table as he explained that the moderator had asked each panelist to discuss both opportunities and challenges facing local companies. The way he emphasized the word challenges sent a chill down my spine, but his expression remained perfectly neutral, almost innocent. The morning sessions proceeded without incident. I attended presentations about regulatory compliance and data privacy, took notes about emerging threats to financial systems, and had productive conversations with several potential clients who were evaluating their cybersecurity needs. The atmosphere was collegial and informative, exactly what I had hoped for when I decided to participate more actively in industry events. My own panel was scheduled for the afternoon, giving me time to review my presentation materials and prepare for questions about our methodology and results. Patricia Wong had agreed to co-present, sharing Cascade Financial's perspective on the implementation process and the measurable improvements they had seen since completing the project. We rehearsed our talking points over lunch, ensuring that our narratives complemented each other, while highlighting the collaborative nature of our working relationship. The cybersecurity panel went better than I had expected. Our presentation was well received, with audience members asking detailed questions about scalability, cost-effectiveness, and applicability to different types of financial institutions. Patricia's endorsement was particularly powerful, as she spoke specifically about the return on investment they had achieved, and the peace of mind that came from knowing their systems were protected by cutting-edge security protocols. I left the panel feeling energized and optimistic about Mitchell Innovation's future prospects. Several attendees had approached me afterward to discuss potential projects, and I had collected business cards from decision-makers at organizations that could provide significant growth opportunities. The conference was turning out to be exactly the kind of productive networking experience that Robert had always said would happen naturally once we had established a solid foundation of successful work. David's panel was scheduled as the day's final keynote presentation, with the provocative title Innovation or Imitation, Separating Real Disruption from Empty Promises in Pacific Northwest Tech. The session was held in the hotel's largest ballroom, with seating for nearly 500 people. By the time I arrived, most of the seats were filled, and the energy in the room suggested that people were expecting something more provocative than the typical conference discussion. The moderator, Jessica Kim from GeekWire, introduced the panel as an opportunity to discuss both the successes and the challenges facing the regional technology ecosystem. She explained that each panelist would share their perspective on what distinguished truly innovative companies from those that relied more on marketing than substance. The framing seemed designed to generate controversy, and I could see David's barely contained excitement as he waited for his turn to speak. The first two panelists offered relatively conventional observations about the importance of customer focus and sustainable business models. Their comments were insightful but safe, the kind of wisdom that everyone in the audience probably already understood. David was third in the speaking order, and I could feel the room's attention shift as Jessica introduced him and his company's recent achievements in the financial technology sector. David began with what seemed like a standard overview of current trends in the industry, discussing the growing importance of cybersecurity and the challenges that financial institutions faced in balancing innovation with regulatory compliance. His delivery was polished and confident, hitting the right notes about collaboration, customer service, and long-term thinking. For the first few minutes, his presentation could have been given by any successful tech executive at any similar conference. The shift began when Jessica asked about emerging competitors and how established companies should evaluate new players in the market. David paused, appearing to consider the question carefully, then launched into what would become the most professionally devastating 5 minutes of my life. He started by acknowledging that competition was healthy, and that the Pacific Northwest was fortunate to have many talented entrepreneurs working on important problems. But then his tone became more serious as he explained that not all claims about innovation and success should be taken at face value. The industry, he suggested, had become too accepting of vague promises and unsubstantiated achievements, too willing to celebrate companies that talked about disruption without demonstrating concrete results. The camera operators were focused on David as he spoke, but I could feel eyes turning toward me as his comments became more specific. He mentioned companies that operated with minimal overhead and claimed this as evidence of efficiency, when it might actually indicate limited scope or questionable sustainability. He talked about businesses that avoided venture capital funding, suggesting that this could reflect either admirable independence or inability to attract serious investors. Each observation was presented as general industry commentary, but the implications were unmistakably personal. David was describing Mitchell Innovations without naming us directly, painting our conservative approach and modest profile as potential warning signs rather than strengths. He was systematically reframing every aspect of our business model as evidence of inadequacy or deception. The moment that destroyed everything came when Jessica asked for a specific example of the dynamics he was describing. David's response was delivered with surgical precision, his voice carrying just the right mix of reluctance and public-minded concern. He explained that he didn't want to single out any particular company, but that the audience deserved to understand how easy it was for appearances to be misleading in an industry where technical expertise was difficult for non-experts to evaluate. Then he mentioned my name, describing me as someone who had been making claims about building a significant technology company while maintaining what appeared to be a deliberately low profile. He suggested that when potential clients or partners looked beneath the surface, when they examined the actual infrastructure, the real scale of operations, the authentic financial foundation, they might find something quite different from what was being presented. The phrase that would haunt me for months came next, delivered with the kind of casual authority that made it seem like an obvious truth rather than a calculated attack. David looked directly into the camera and said that while there were many legitimate success stories in Seattle's tech community, there were also examples of what he called artificial prosperity, situations where people created the impression of wealth and achievement without the underlying substance to support those claims. He never explicitly accused me of fraud or deliberate deception, but the implication was clear to everyone in the room. Sarah Mitchell, he was suggesting, was someone whose supposed success was built on smoke and mirrors, someone whose modest lifestyle and quiet approach to business might actually be evidence that there was nothing substantial underneath. The audience was being invited to question everything they thought they knew about my company and my achievements. The panel continued for another 20 minutes, but I heard none of it. I sat in my seat, feeling the weight of 500 pairs of eyes, watching my professional reputation crumble in real time. Social media was already lighting up with clips of David's remarks, and I could see people in the audience pulling out their phones to research Mitchell innovations, probably looking for evidence that would either support or refute his insinuations. When the session ended, the ballroom emptied quickly as people rushed to continue their conversations in smaller groups. I remained in my seat, staring at the stage where David was now surrounded by admirers and reporters, basking in the attention his controversial comments had generated. He had achieved exactly what he set out to do, transforming himself from a business rival into an industry thought leader, while simultaneously destroying my credibility with a single perfectly crafted presentation. The walk back to my hotel room felt endless, each step carrying me further from the confident professional I had been that morning toward an uncertain future where everything I had built could be called into question. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls and text messages, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. I knew what I would find: reporters seeking comment, clients expressing concern, colleagues distancing themselves from someone whose reputation had suddenly become toxic. That night, alone in my hotel room overlooking Elliott Bay, I tried to process what had happened and figure out how to respond. David had been brilliant in his attack, never making claims that could be easily disproven, never crossing the line into obvious defamation, but creating doubt that would be almost impossible to dispel. How do you prove that your success is real when the very evidence of that success, your conservative lifestyle and modest public profile, has been reframed as proof that you're hiding something? The tragedy was that David's attack worked precisely because there were elements of truth in his observations. Mitchell Innovations was indeed a small company with modest overhead. I did maintain a low profile and avoid the kind of aggressive self-promotion that many successful entrepreneurs embraced. I hadn't raised venture capital, and I did live in a studio apartment despite running a profitable business. All of these facts were true, but David had weaponized them, transforming strengths into apparent weaknesses through the power of strategic narrative manipulation. As I stared out at the lights reflecting on the dark water of the Sound, I realized that I was facing a crisis that went far beyond reputation management or damage control. David hadn't just questioned my success, he had attacked the fundamental approach that Robert had taught me, the philosophy that had guided every decision I had made about building Mitchell Innovations. If David was right, if appearances mattered more than substance in the modern business world, then everything I had been working toward was not just wrong but potentially self-destructive.
The irony, which I wouldn't discover for several more months, was that David's attack had been perfectly timed to occur just as I was about to learn that my actual financial situation was so far beyond anything he could have imagined that his accusations of artificial prosperity would soon seem not just wrong but almost comically misguided. But on that night in Seattle, watching my professional world collapse in real time, I had no idea that Robert Whitman had left me with the means to not just survive David's assault, but to demonstrate just how fundamentally he had misunderstood everything about my life and my prospects. Part 4, The Foundation Flashback. The University of Washington campus in early autumn had always been my sanctuary, a place where intellectual curiosity mattered more than social status or family connections. Walking across the quad on that September morning in my senior year, with maple leaves beginning to turn gold against the backdrop of Mount Rainier, I felt the familiar comfort of being surrounded by people who valued ideas over appearances. It was 2019, and I was 3 weeks into what would become the most transformative period of my academic career. My parents had been gone for 2 years by then, killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver on Interstate 90 during what was supposed to be a celebratory weekend trip to celebrate my acceptance into the computer science program. The insurance settlement had covered tuition and basic living expenses, but it had also left me emotionally adrift in ways that I was still learning to navigate. Academic success had become both my coping mechanism and my primary source of identity, the one area of my life where I felt capable of exercising meaningful control. The advanced cryptography seminar that would change my life was held in a nondescript classroom in the Paul G. Allen Center, with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly gray and institutional. Professor Robert Whitman had a reputation as one of the most demanding instructors in the computer science department, someone who expected graduate-level thinking from undergraduates and had no patience for students who weren't prepared to meet that standard. His course was notorious for driving away anyone who wasn't absolutely serious about understanding the mathematical foundations of secure communication systems. I had enrolled despite warnings from classmates, who described the workload as overwhelming and the grading as ruthlessly objective. Something about the course description had appealed to me, particularly the emphasis on real-world applications of theoretical concepts. After spending 2 years studying abstract algorithms and programming languages, I was hungry for coursework that connected to meaningful problems beyond academic exercises. The first class meeting confirmed everything I had heard about Professor Whitman's expectations. He opened the semester by explaining that cryptography was not just an academic discipline, but a fundamental tool for protecting individual privacy and institutional integrity in an increasingly connected world. The students who succeeded in his course, he explained, would develop not just technical skills, but a deeper understanding of how information security shaped economic and political relationships on a global scale. His teaching style was unlike anything I had experienced in previous computer science courses. Rather than focusing on memorizing algorithms or implementing standard solutions to well-defined problems, Professor Whitman challenged us to think like adversaries, to identify vulnerabilities in seemingly secure systems, and to develop countermeasures that could withstand sophisticated attacks over time. Each assignment required not just correct answers, but clear explanations of our reasoning and thorough analysis of potential failure modes. The workload was indeed overwhelming, but it was also intellectually exhilarating in ways that made the long hours feel meaningful rather than punitive. I found myself staying up late not because I had to, but because I was genuinely fascinated by the problems we were exploring. The intersection of mathematics, computer science, and economic theory created a kind of puzzle-solving environment that engaged every aspect of my analytical thinking. My financial situation was becoming increasingly precarious as the semester progressed. The campus computer lab job that had sustained me through my first 2 years was barely covering rent and food, leaving nothing for textbooks, software licenses, or the other expenses that came with upper-level coursework. I had started skipping meals to stretch my grocery budget, and I was falling behind on assignments that required expensive development tools that I couldn't afford to purchase. The stress was starting to show in my academic performance, not because I lacked understanding of the material, but because I was constantly distracted by worries about money. Late-night study sessions were interrupted by calculations about whether I could afford both electricity and internet for the next month. Group projects became awkward when I couldn't contribute to shared expenses for presentation materials or software resources. Professor Whitman noticed my struggles before I realized how obvious they had become. He approached me after class on a rainy October afternoon, asking if I might have a few minutes to discuss my performance in the course. I assumed he was preparing to suggest that I drop the class or seek additional tutoring, conversations that would have been devastating but not entirely surprising given my recent difficulties keeping up with assignments. Instead, he led me to his office in the Allen Center, a cramped space lined with technical journals and stacks of research papers that reached nearly to the ceiling. The walls were covered with whiteboards filled with equations and diagrams that looked like the remnants of intense problem-solving sessions. Despite the cluttered appearance, everything seemed organized according to some system that made sense to him, creating an environment that felt productive rather than chaotic. He offered me coffee from a machine that looked like it had been purchased sometime in the 1990s, then settled into his desk chair with the kind of unhurried attention that suggested he had cleared his schedule for this conversation. His first question caught me completely off guard. He asked whether I was interested in pursuing graduate studies in cryptography and information security, and if so, whether I had given thought to how I might fund that education. I explained my situation honestly, describing the insurance settlement that covered tuition but not living expenses, the part-time job that was barely sufficient for basic needs, and my growing concern that financial pressures might force me to scale back my academic ambitions. I had been considering transferring to a less expensive school or switching to a major that would lead more directly to immediate employment after graduation. Professor Whitman listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding in ways that suggested he had heard similar stories from other students. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and explained that he was currently working on several research projects that could benefit from a dedicated undergraduate research assistant. The work would be more demanding than typical campus employment, he warned, but it would also pay significantly better and provide experience that would be directly relevant to graduate studies or private sector employment. The project he described involved analyzing security vulnerabilities in financial transaction systems, particularly the kinds of weaknesses that could be exploited by sophisticated attackers to compromise institutional networks or steal sensitive data. The work would require both technical programming skills and the kind of systematic thinking that his course was designed to develop. More importantly, it would provide insight into how academic research translated into practical applications that affected real organizations and their customers. I accepted the position immediately, partly because I needed the income, but mostly because the research sounded fascinating. Professor Whitman explained that I would start by learning to use specialized security analysis tools, then gradually take on more independent responsibilities as my skills developed. The ultimate goal was to produce research that could be published in academic journals and potentially licensed to companies working on similar problems. The transition from struggling student to research assistant transformed my entire university experience. The additional income eliminated my constant financial stress, allowing me to focus completely on academic work for the first time since my
parents' death. More importantly, the research gave me access to Professor Whitman's expertise and professional network in ways that would have been impossible through classroom instruction alone. Working closely with him revealed aspects of his background that weren't apparent from his academic credentials. His understanding of financial systems went far beyond what most computer science professors would have acquired through purely academic research. He spoke knowledgeably about international banking regulations, currency exchange mechanisms, and the political considerations that shaped cybersecurity policies in different countries. His perspective was informed by practical experience that he rarely discussed directly, but that influenced everything he taught. Over the course of our first semester working together, I learned that Professor Whitman had spent nearly a decade in the private sector before transitioning to academia. He had worked for several major financial institutions, developing the security protocols that protected electronic transactions during the early days of online banking. That experience had made him wealthy, but it had also convinced him that academic research was essential for staying ahead of increasingly sophisticated threats to financial systems. His approach to research was methodical and patient in ways that distinguished him from colleagues who were focused on generating quick publications or securing grant funding. Professor Whitman was interested in understanding fundamental problems and developing solutions that would remain relevant for decades rather than months. He often said that real security required thinking like an adversary who had unlimited time and resources, then building defenses that could withstand that level of sustained attack. The research we conducted together during my senior year laid the groundwork for everything I would later accomplish professionally. Professor Whitman taught me to approach complex systems analysis with the same rigor that mathematicians brought to formal proofs, requiring clear documentation of every assumption and thorough testing of every conclusion. He showed me how to identify potential failure points that weren't obvious from surface-level analysis, and how to develop countermeasures that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. More importantly, he helped me understand the broader context in which cybersecurity operated, the ways that technical decisions had economic and social implications that extended far beyond the immediate organizations we were trying to protect. Financial security, he explained, was ultimately about enabling trust in systems that allowed people to participate in economic activities that would be impossible without reliable methods for protecting sensitive information. The personal relationship that developed alongside our professional collaboration became the closest thing to a father-daughter dynamic that I had experienced since losing my parents. Professor Whitman was genuinely interested in my career development and personal well-being, but he expressed that concern through practical support rather than emotional gestures. He helped me navigate graduate school applications, connected me with internship opportunities, and gradually introduced me to professional networks that would prove invaluable throughout my career. His influence extended to practical life skills that I hadn't learned from my parents, particularly around financial management and long-term planning. Professor Whitman helped me understand the importance of building multiple income streams, diversifying investments across different types of assets, and thinking about wealth as a tool for creating options rather than just a means for purchasing consumer goods. These conversations were always framed as general life advice rather than specific financial guidance, but they shaped my approach to every major decision I made after graduation. During my final semester, Professor Whitman began discussing the possibility of continuing our research collaboration after my graduation, either through a formal graduate program or through some kind of consulting arrangement that would allow me to pursue professional opportunities while maintaining access to university resources. He seemed particularly interested in my ideas about applying our security analysis methods to smaller financial institutions that lacked the resources to develop comprehensive cybersecurity programs internally. The conversations about my future became more specific as graduation approached. Professor Whitman suggested that I consider starting a consulting firm that could bridge the gap between academic research and practical implementation, serving clients who needed sophisticated security solutions but couldn't afford the major consulting firms that specialized in working with large corporations. He offered to serve as an advisor and to help me establish relationships with potential clients through his professional network. Those discussions planted the seeds of what would eventually become Mitchell Innovations, but they also established the foundation for a financial relationship that I wouldn't fully understand until years later. Professor Whitman helped me set up the investment account that would grow into something far more significant than either of us discussed at the time. He presented it as a simple way to ensure long-term financial stability, but the structure he created was actually the beginning of a wealth-building strategy that would eventually provide me with resources I couldn't have imagined as a struggling undergraduate.
The graduation ceremony itself was bittersweet, marking the end of the most intellectually rewarding period of my education while launching me into an uncertain professional future. Professor Whitman attended the ceremony, bringing a camera to take pictures that he later had framed and sent to my apartment. His presence meant more to me than I was able to express at the time, representing both the academic achievement that had given me confidence and the personal relationship that had helped me rebuild my life after my parents' death. The transition from student to entrepreneur was more challenging than either of us had anticipated, requiring skills and perspectives that couldn't be learned through academic research alone. But the foundation that Professor Whitman had provided, both technical and personal, proved sufficient to support the gradual development of a successful consulting practice. His ongoing advice and encouragement during those early years were essential for maintaining confidence when client relationships were difficult or when technical challenges seemed overwhelming. Looking back, I realized that Professor Whitman was preparing me for responsibilities and opportunities that extended far beyond what we ever discussed explicitly. He was teaching me to think like someone who would eventually manage significant resources, make decisions that affected other people's livelihoods, and navigate complex professional relationships where technical competence was necessary but not sufficient for success. The lessons he taught about patience, systematic thinking, and long-term planning would prove essential not just for building Mitchell Innovations, but for eventually managing the financial empire that he had been quietly constructing on my behalf. The revelation of that empire's true scope was still months away when David Chen destroyed my reputation at the Seattle conference, but the foundation Professor Whitman had provided was already sufficient to sustain me through the crisis that followed. The principles he had taught about focusing on substance over appearances, building systems that could withstand sustained attacks, and maintaining confidence in long-term strategies would prove essential for surviving the most challenging period of my professional life and ultimately emerging stronger than anyone, including David, could have imagined possible. The morning I received the call about Robert Whitman's death started like any other Tuesday in March 2022. I was reviewing security protocols for a new client when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, displaying a 206 area code that suggested it was local. Elena Rodriguez identified herself as an attorney with Whitman and Associates, explaining in carefully measured tones that Professor Whitman had passed away unexpectedly the previous evening and that she was contacting people who had been mentioned in his personal papers. The news hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the loss but because of how completely unprepared I was for it. Robert had seemed healthy and energetic during our last conversation just 2 weeks earlier when he had called to congratulate me on landing the Cascade financial contract and to discuss some investment opportunities he thought might interest me. At 72, he had been slowing down slightly but still maintained the kind of intellectual vigor that made age seem irrelevant. Elena explained that Robert had suffered a massive heart attack while working late in his home office, apparently dying instantly with no suffering or prolonged illness. The medical examiner had determined that there were no suspicious circumstances, just the kind of sudden cardiac event that could happen to anyone, regardless of their apparent health status. She assured me that his affairs were well organized and that there would be no complications with his estate, but that there were certain matters he had specifically wanted to discuss with me. The funeral service was held 4 days later at University Presbyterian Church, a modest brick building near the campus where Robert had spent the final decades of his career. The attendance was surprisingly large for someone who had lived quietly and avoided public attention, with current and former students, academic colleagues, and a surprising number of people who appeared to be from the business world rather than the university community. I sat toward the back of the church, feeling simultaneously grateful for the opportunity to pay my respects and overwhelmed by the realization that this marked the end of the most important mentoring relationship of my life. The speakers who came forward to share memories painted a picture of someone who had touched many lives through quiet generosity and patient guidance, confirming what I had experienced personally but revealing the broader scope of his influence. One speaker, a former student who now worked for the Federal Reserve, described how Robert's research had influenced national cybersecurity policies in ways that weren't publicly recognized, but that had prevented numerous potential attacks on critical financial infrastructure. Another, a woman who ran a nonprofit focused on financial literacy, explained how Robert had provided both funding and technical expertise that had allowed them to serve thousands of low-income families who would otherwise have remained excluded from mainstream banking services. As I listened to these testimonials, I began to understand that Robert had been operating on multiple levels simultaneously, maintaining his academic career while also pursuing business interests and philanthropic activities that he had never discussed with me directly. The scope of his influence was far broader than I had realized, encompassing not just university research, but practical applications that had affected real people's lives in measurable ways. The reception following the service was held in the Allen Center, in the same building where I had first worked as Robert's research assistant. The familiar surroundings brought back memories of countless hours spent analyzing security vulnerabilities and discussing the broader implications of our work. But the conversations I had with other attendees revealed aspects of Robert's life and career that I had never known about, despite our close relationship. Margaret Chen, a colleague from the computer science department, mentioned that Robert had been one of the original advisors to several successful technology companies that had grown out of university research projects. She described him as someone who understood how to bridge the gap between academic innovation and commercial application, helping promising ideas transition from research papers to viable businesses that could scale their impact. James Morrison, who introduced himself as a portfolio manager with a Seattle investment firm, explained that Robert had been one of his most successful clients for nearly 3 decades. He spoke about Robert's unusual approach to wealth building, which combined traditional investment strategies with early-stage funding for technology companies whose potential wasn't yet recognized by mainstream venture capital. According to James, Robert had achieved remarkable returns by identifying innovations that were 5 to 10 years ahead of market acceptance. These conversations left me feeling confused about my own relationship with Robert and wondering how much I had actually known about his life outside our academic collaboration. He had clearly been involved in business activities that went far beyond anything we had discussed, and he seemed to have maintained professional relationships with people who operated in completely different spheres from university research. Elena Rodriguez approached me toward the end of the reception, suggesting that we schedule a meeting to discuss certain matters that Robert had specifically wanted to address with me. She couldn't provide details in such a public setting, she explained, but there were documents and arrangements that required my attention sooner rather than later. Her tone suggested that whatever Robert had planned was more significant than routine estate administration. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at Elena's downtown Seattle office, a sleek space in Columbia Center with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. Elena had Robert's files organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that suggested she had been working with him for years rather than just handling his estate. The scope of the documentation was far more extensive than I had expected for someone whose lifestyle had appeared relatively modest. Elena began by explaining that Robert had been planning for this conversation for several years, updating his instructions as recently as 6 months before his death. He had been very specific about the timing and sequence of disclosures, wanting to ensure that I would be emotionally prepared to understand the full scope of what he had arranged. She emphasized that everything had been structured to comply with all applicable laws and regulations, but that the complexity required careful explanation to avoid misunderstandings. The first revelation was that Robert had been significantly wealthier than his academic lifestyle had suggested. His early career in financial technology had generated substantial returns that he had invested systematically over several decades, building a portfolio that now included real estate holdings, equity positions in dozens of companies, and partnership stakes in several investment funds. The total value was well into 8 figures, representing the kind of wealth that would have supported a very different lifestyle if he had chosen to pursue it. More surprising was the discovery that Robert had structured much of this wealth in ways that would eventually benefit me, though he had done so through mechanisms that weren't immediately obvious. The investment account that he had helped me establish during my senior year was actually connected to a much larger trust structure that included provisions for transferring additional assets based on specific milestones and circumstances. Elena explained that Robert had been particularly concerned about my ability to maintain financial independence while building Mitchell Innovations, recognizing that the conservative approach he had encouraged might leave me vulnerable to competitive pressures from better-funded rivals. He had wanted to ensure that I would eventually have access to resources that could support aggressive expansion if I chose to pursue it, but he had also wanted me to develop the skills and experience necessary to manage significant wealth responsibly. The mechanisms he had created were designed to activate gradually, providing increasing access to capital as I demonstrated success in building and managing my own business. The Cascade financial contract had triggered one such milestone, releasing additional funds that would allow me to expand Mitchell Innovations' operations significantly if I chose to do so. But there were also provisions for much larger transfers based on circumstances that Robert had anticipated might arise. According to Elena, Robert had been particularly concerned about the possibility that competitors might attempt to undermine my reputation or question the authenticity of my success. He had observed similar dynamics in other industries where established players used perception management to marginalize emerging threats, and he wanted to ensure that I would have the resources to respond effectively if such attacks occurred. The trust structure he had created included specific provisions for situations where my business or reputation came under attack from competitors or media sources. In such circumstances, I would gain access to additional resources that could be used not just for legal defense but for strategic initiatives that would demonstrate the substance behind my work. Robert had wanted to ensure that any attempts to portray me as unsuccessful or fraudulent would ultimately backfire by revealing the true extent of my financial resources. Elena handed me a sealed envelope that Robert had prepared specifically for this moment, with instructions that it should be opened only after she had explained the basic structure of his arrangements. The letter inside was written in his familiar handwriting, but the tone was more personal and direct than his typical communication style. He explained that he had seen in me the kind of principled approach to business and technology that he valued most, and that he wanted to ensure I would have the resources to pursue my vision without compromise. The letter revealed that Robert had been thinking strategically about my development from almost the beginning of our relationship, recognizing potential that I hadn't seen in myself and planning for opportunities that I couldn't have imagined. He had deliberately kept me unaware of the full scope of his financial support because he wanted me to develop confidence and skills based on my own achievements rather than inherited advantages. But he had also been preparing for the possibility that I would eventually need significant resources to compete effectively in an industry where financial backing often determines success, regardless of technical merit. The trust structure he had created was designed to provide those resources at the moment when they would be most useful, while also ensuring that I would have demonstrated the judgment and experience necessary to use them effectively. The specific dollar amounts mentioned in Robert's letter were staggering, representing resources that would place me among the wealthiest individuals in the Pacific Northwest technology sector. But the letter also emphasized that wealth was merely a tool for pursuing objectives that mattered, and that the true test of success would be how effectively I used these resources to advance the kinds of innovations that could benefit society more broadly. Elena explained that accessing these resources would require specific actions on my part, including formal acceptance of trustee responsibilities and agreement to certain conditions that Robert had established to ensure the money would be used appropriately. The process was designed to be gradual and reversible, allowing me to increase my involvement as I became more comfortable with the responsibilities involved. The immediate practical implications were significant enough to change everything about how I approached Mitchell Innovations' future development. The resources that were immediately available would allow me to expand our operations dramatically, hire additional staff, invest in advanced technology platforms, and pursue marketing initiatives that could establish us as a major player in the cybersecurity industry. But the longer-term implications were even more transformative. Robert had essentially created a financial foundation that could support any reasonable business initiative I chose to pursue, while also providing the kind of security that would allow me to take risks and pursue innovations that might not generate immediate returns. The wealth he had accumulated and structured for my benefit represented freedom to pursue my vision without compromise or external constraints. As Elena walked me through the administrative details of activating these arrangements, I began to understand the full scope of what Robert had accomplished and why he had been so secretive about it. He had been building not just wealth but a legacy, creating resources that could support the kind of principled innovation that he believed was essential for addressing technological challenges that were becoming increasingly critical. The timing of these revelations, coming just months before David Chen would launch his attack on my reputation, seemed almost prophetic. Robert had anticipated exactly the kind of situation I would soon face, and he had prepared resources that would allow me to respond from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The modest lifestyle and conservative business approach that David would weaponize as evidence of failure were actually evidence of the kind of long-term thinking that had built substantial wealth over decades. Walking out of Elena's office that afternoon, I felt simultaneously overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Robert had entrusted to me and energized by the possibilities it represented. The foundation he had provided would allow me to pursue ambitious goals that had previously seemed unrealistic, while also honoring the principles he had taught me about focusing on substance over appearance and long-term impact over short-term recognition. The irony that would become apparent months later was that David Chen's attack on my supposed lack of authentic wealth would occur at precisely the moment when I was gaining access to resources that dwarfed anything his venture capital-backed company had ever achieved. Robert's legacy would ultimately provide not just the means to survive David's assault, but to demonstrate just how fundamentally wrong his assumptions about my situation had been. But even more important than the financial resources was the validation of the approach that Robert had taught me, the confirmation that patient, principled business building could generate results that were not just sustainable but transformational. The wealth he had created and shared represented proof that the methods he had advocated were not just theoretically sound but practically superior to the flashier alternatives that dominated the technology industry. The encrypted USB drive arrived by certified mail 3 weeks after David Chen's public demolition of my reputation, delivered to my Capitol Hill apartment with no return address except for a Swiss postal code that meant nothing to me at the time. The package was small, professional, wrapped in the kind of discreet packaging that international banks use for sensitive documents. Inside was a single silver device, no larger than my thumb, along with a handwritten note that simply read, "Access codes, your birthday, Robert's favorite theorem, questions will be answered in Geneva." I stared at the note for several minutes, trying to make sense of what seemed like an elaborate puzzle. My birthday was straightforward enough, but Robert's favorite theorem could have referred to any number of mathematical concepts we had discussed during our years of working together. He had often mentioned his appreciation for Fermat's last theorem, but he had also expressed admiration for Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the fundamental theorem of arithmetic. The timing of the package's arrival felt too coincidental to ignore. 3 weeks was exactly long enough for someone monitoring the Seattle tech scene to have observed the aftermath of David's conference attack and concluded that I might be receptive to alternative explanations for my circumstances. The professional presentation and Swiss origin suggested serious financial institutions rather than elaborate pranks or scam attempts. I inserted the USB drive into my laptop with the kind of nervous anticipation that comes from knowing you're about to discover something that might change everything. The device prompted for a password, and I tried various combinations of my birth date and mathematical theorems until 040795 Fermat finally unlocked a single encrypted folder containing dozens of documents with names that meant nothing to me initially. The files were organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything Robert had ever done, but the scope and complexity were far beyond anything I had expected. Investment statements, partnership agreements, property deeds, and corporate documents were arranged in chronological order dating back nearly 30 years. The dollar amounts mentioned throughout were staggering, representing assets and income streams that would place Robert among the wealthiest individuals in the Pacific Northwest. The first document that made sense to me was a letter dated just 6 months before Robert's death, written in his familiar precise handwriting and addressed to me directly. He explained that the USB drive would be delivered if certain conditions were met, specifically if my business or reputation came under attack from competitors who questioned the authenticity of my success. He had anticipated exactly the kind of situation David had created, and he had prepared evidence that would provide context for understanding my true financial position. According to Robert's letter, the modest investment account he had helped me establish during my university years was connected to a much larger financial structure that he had been building for decades. The quarterly statements I had been receiving represented only the most visible portion of a portfolio that included real estate holdings across 3 continents, equity positions in dozens of technology companies, and partnership stakes in several private investment funds. The documentation revealed that Robert had been far more than an academic who had dabbled in private sector consulting. He had been one of the original architects of secure financial transaction systems, working with European banks during the 1980s and 1990s to develop the protocols that became the foundation of modern digital banking. That work had generated substantial licensing fees and consulting income that he had invested systematically over several decades. More importantly, Robert's early involvement in financial technology had given him insights into emerging trends that allowed him to identify promising companies years before they became visible to mainstream investors. The USB drive contained evidence of early investments in firms that had become industry leaders, generating returns that compounded into enormous wealth over time. The specific mechanism that connected Robert's wealth to my situation was more complex than I had imagined. Rather than
simply leaving me money through traditional inheritance, he had structured a series of trusts and partnerships that would gradually transfer control of his assets based on specific milestones in my professional development. The Cascade financial contract had triggered one such transfer, releasing additional resources that I hadn't even realized were available. But the most significant revelations were still hidden in files that required additional passwords, codes that were referenced in Robert's letter but not spelled out directly. He had written about the Geneva accounts and the primary holdings in ways that suggested they represented the largest portion of his wealth, resources that would only become accessible under specific circumstances that he described as existential threats to your financial independence. David Chen's public attack apparently qualified as such a threat because the letter included instructions for contacting Elena Rodriguez at her Geneva office and using specific phrases that would identify me as the intended recipient of additional information. Robert had anticipated that I might need not just access to his wealth, but also professional guidance for managing resources that exceeded anything I had experience handling. The process of unlocking the remaining files required solving additional puzzles that tested my memory of conversations Robert and I had shared during our years of working together. His favorite restaurant in Seattle, the title of the first research paper we had published together, the exact amount of my first investment account deposit. Each correct answer revealed additional layers of documentation that painted an increasingly comprehensive picture of the financial empire he had built. By the time I had accessed all the files, I was looking at assets that totaled well over $1 billion, distributed across investment vehicles and geographic locations in ways that would have been impossible for me to discover through conventional research. Robert had been operating simultaneously as an academic, a technology consultant, and a sophisticated international investor, building wealth through strategies that took advantage of opportunities I hadn't even known existed. The documentation also revealed the extent to which Robert had been planning for my eventual involvement in managing these resources. Training materials, contact lists for financial advisors and legal representatives, and detailed explanations of investment strategies were organized in ways that would allow someone with my background to understand complex financial instruments and international banking relationships. Most surprising was the discovery that Robert had been monitoring my business development much more closely than I had realized, maintaining detailed records of Mitchell Innovations' financial performance and strategic decisions. His files included analyses of our competitive position, assessments of potential growth opportunities, and projections for how additional capital could accelerate our expansion into new markets. The letter that accompanied these business analyses explained Robert's thinking about the technology industry and his belief that companies built on solid technical foundations would eventually outperform those that relied primarily on marketing and venture capital funding. He had structured his wealth transfers to provide me with resources that could support patient, long-term strategies rather than forcing me to pursue rapid growth that might compromise our technical standards. According to Robert's projections, the combination of Mitchell Innovations' existing capabilities and the financial resources he was making available could create a technology company that would dominate the cybersecurity sector within 5 years. The capital would allow us to hire top-tier talent, invest in cutting-edge research and development, and pursue market opportunities that were currently beyond our reach due to resource constraints. But Robert had also included warnings about the challenges that would come with managing significant wealth, particularly the ways that public knowledge of financial resources could attract unwanted attention from competitors, regulators, and media sources. He had designed the transfer mechanisms to be gradual and discreet, allowing me to increase my financial capacity without creating obvious changes in lifestyle or business operations that might generate speculation about the source of additional resources. The final set of documents included specific instructions for responding to the kind of attack that David Chen had launched, using the revelation of substantial financial resources to demonstrate that accusations of artificial prosperity were not just wrong but almost comically misguided. Robert had prepared detailed strategies for managing media attention, working with public relations professionals, and timing disclosure of information for maximum impact on competitors who had overextended themselves through aggressive attacks. Reading through Robert's comprehensive planning, I began to understand that he had been preparing for this moment for years, anticipating the challenges I would face, and creating resources that would allow me to respond from a position of unassailable strength. The modest lifestyle and conservative business approach that David had weaponized as evidence of failure were actually evidence of the kind of disciplined thinking that had built enormous wealth over decades. The immediate practical implications were overwhelming. The resources that were now available to me would allow Mitchell Innovations to expand operations dramatically, but they would also require me to develop skills and knowledge that went far beyond technology consulting. Robert had essentially transformed me from a small business owner into the manager of a financial empire, with all the responsibilities and opportunities that such a position entailed. The phone number provided for Elena Rodriguez's Geneva office connected me directly to her personal assistant, who scheduled a confidential video conference for the following morning. Elena's manner was professional but warm, suggesting that she had been anticipating my call and was prepared to provide the guidance that Robert's documentation had promised. During our 90-minute conversation, Elena explained that Robert had been one of her most important clients for over 20 years, and that she had been intimately involved in structuring the financial arrangements that were now being transferred to my control. She confirmed that the documentation I had accessed represented an accurate but incomplete picture of the total resources available, and that additional assets would become accessible as I demonstrated readiness to manage them effectively.
The process Elena described for taking full control of Robert's financial legacy would require several trips to Geneva over the coming months, as well as extensive education about international banking, investment management, and tax optimization strategies. But she also assured me that the initial resources being transferred were sufficient to address any immediate challenges I was facing, including the reputational damage that David Chen's attack had created. Elena's confidence in my ability to manage these resources was based partly on Robert's detailed assessments of my character and capabilities, but also on her own observations of how I had built Mitchell Innovations according to principles that were consistent with successful long-term wealth management. The conservative approach that had made me vulnerable to David's attacks was actually evidence of the kind of disciplined thinking that Robert had valued most highly. As our conversation concluded, Elena provided specific recommendations for responding to the current crisis in ways that would demonstrate the substance behind my work, without revealing more about my financial situation than was strategically advantageous. The goal was to discredit David's accusations comprehensively while maintaining the privacy and flexibility that would allow me to continue building Mitchell Innovations according to my own vision. Hanging up the phone after that conversation, I felt a complex mixture of excitement and trepidation about the future that Robert had made possible. The financial resources he had provided would allow me to pursue ambitious goals that had previously seemed unrealistic, but they would also require me to develop capabilities and perspectives that went far beyond my current experience. The irony that David Chen had unknowingly triggered my access to resources that dwarfed anything his venture capital-backed company had ever achieved was not lost on me. His attack on my supposed lack of authentic wealth had occurred at precisely the moment when I was discovering that I controlled assets that would make me one of the wealthiest individuals in the technology sector. But even more important than the financial resources was the validation of the approach that Robert had taught me, the confirmation that patient, principled business building could generate results that were not just sustainable but transformational. The wealth he had created and shared represented proof that the methods he had advocated were superior to the flashier alternatives that dominated the industry. The challenge now was figuring out how to use these resources in ways that would honor Robert's legacy while also demonstrating to David Chen and everyone else who had doubted my capabilities that their assumptions about my situation had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. The apartment in Capitol Hill had never felt smaller than it did during those first weeks after discovering Robert's encrypted files. While the documentation revealed financial resources that would change everything, the immediate reality remained unchanged. I was still living in a studio space barely large enough for a bed and desk, still fielding calls from former clients who were reconsidering their relationships with Mitchell Innovations, still watching my professional reputation crumble in real time across social media platforms. The contrast between my hidden wealth and my visible circumstances created a surreal psychological tension that I struggled to navigate. Each morning I would wake up knowing that I had access to resources that could transform my situation overnight, but also understanding that revealing those resources prematurely could create even bigger problems than the ones I was currently facing. Robert's warnings about discretion and timing had taken on new urgency as I watched how quickly perception could override reality in the modern business world. The phone calls from reporters had intensified rather than diminished in the weeks following David's conference attack. Technology journalists who had never shown interest in Mitchell Innovations were suddenly eager to investigate the story of a supposedly successful entrepreneur, whose lifestyle suggested something different from her public claims. Each conversation felt like walking through a minefield, requiring careful answers that wouldn't provide ammunition for additional attacks, while also avoiding outright lies that could create legal problems later. Jessica Kim from GeekWire was particularly persistent, calling multiple times to request interviews about my response to David's allegations and my plans for addressing the questions that had been raised about Mitchell Innovations' actual financial performance. Her tone was professional but skeptical, suggesting that she had already decided the story she wanted to tell and was mainly seeking quotes that would support her predetermined narrative. The most painful aspect of the crisis was watching former allies distance themselves from someone whose reputation had become toxic almost overnight. Patricia Wong from Cascade Financial, who had been enthusiastic about expanding our working relationship just weeks earlier, suddenly became unavailable for calls and stopped responding to emails about the partnership opportunities we had been discussing. Her assistant explained that the company was reassessing their vendor relationships and would be in touch when they had completed their strategic review. 3 potential clients who had been moving toward signing contracts with Mitchell Innovations requested additional references and financial documentation that went far beyond what had been required for previous projects. The subtext was clear: David's public questioning of my authenticity had created doubt that would need to be addressed before any new business relationships could proceed. The irony was that I could have provided financial documentation that would have eliminated all concerns, but revealing the true scope of my resources would have raised different questions that I wasn't prepared to answer. My small team was struggling with the uncertainty as much as I was, though they tried to maintain professional composure during our daily check-ins. Maria Santos, my operations manager, had started asking pointed questions about our pipeline and cash flow projections that suggested she was considering whether to look for other opportunities. The 2 junior developers seemed nervous during team meetings, frequently checking their phones and avoiding eye contact when we discussed upcoming project deadlines. The worst moment came during what should have been a routine client call with Northwest Credit Union, an organization we had been working with successfully for over a year. Their IT director, someone who had praised our work enthusiastically in previous conversations, opened the meeting by explaining that their board had raised questions about continuing relationships with vendors whose financial stability was being questioned in industry publications. He emphasized that they weren't making any immediate changes to our contract, but that they would need additional assurances about Mitchell Innovations' long-term viability before approving the expansion project we had been planning together. The conversation was professionally courteous but devastating in its implications, demonstrating how quickly trust could evaporate when competitive attacks successfully planted seeds of doubt. The financial impact was becoming measurable by the end of the first month. 2 signed contracts were put on hold, pending additional due diligence that might never be completed. 3 proposals that had been moving toward acceptance were withdrawn, as potential clients decided to explore other options without providing specific explanations for their decisions. The revenue pipeline that had been growing steadily for years was suddenly contracting in ways that threatened our ability to meet basic operational expenses. Sleep became increasingly elusive as I spent nights calculating how long our cash reserves would last if the business contraction continued. The bitter irony was that I had access to resources that could fund Mitchell Innovations' operations for decades, but utilizing those resources would require explanations that I wasn't ready to provide. Robert's careful planning had created financial security, but it hadn't eliminated the immediate psychological stress of watching my life's work collapse in public. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the situation. Friends in the technology industry were avoiding association with someone whose reputation was under attack, either because they believed David's insinuations or because they were concerned about how their own reputations might be affected by proximity to controversy. Professional networking events became uncomfortable as conversations stopped when I approached groups, and invitations to industry gatherings suddenly became rare. Even routine interactions became charged with subtext and second-guessing. Coffee meetings with potential partners were canceled at the last minute with vague explanations about scheduling conflicts. Former colleagues who had been friendly and supportive became formal and distant, maintaining professional courtesy while clearly creating emotional distance from someone whose career was apparently in decline. The psychological pressure was compounded by the constant temptation to solve everything immediately by revealing the financial resources that Robert had made available. Every difficult conversation, every lost opportunity, every moment of professional humiliation could have been ended instantly by demonstrating access to wealth that would dwarf anything David Chen had ever achieved. But Robert's documentation had been clear about the importance of timing and strategy in managing such revelations. The media attention was creating additional complications beyond the immediate business impact. A freelance journalist who had been investigating Seattle's technology scene for a national business publication contacted me about including Mitchell Innovations in a larger story about startup failures and entrepreneurial deception. His questions suggested that he viewed my situation as an example of how easy it was to create false impressions of success in an industry where technical expertise was difficult for outsiders to evaluate. My lawyer advised against participating in any interviews until we had developed a comprehensive strategy for addressing the allegations that were circulating through industry networks. But refusing to comment was also problematic, as it could be interpreted as evidence that there was indeed something to hide. The situation felt like being trapped in a maze where every possible move led to additional problems. The emotional toll was becoming as challenging as the professional consequences. I found myself questioning decisions that had seemed obviously correct just months earlier, wondering whether Robert's advice about maintaining a low profile and focusing on substance over appearance had been outdated wisdom that left me vulnerable to modern forms of competition. Maybe David had been right that perception mattered more than reality in contemporary business, and maybe I had been naive to believe that good work would speak for itself. The studio apartment that had felt cozy and efficient during successful periods now seemed like evidence of everything David had suggested about my actual circumstances. The second-hand furniture, the lack of luxury amenities, the general modesty of my lifestyle could indeed be interpreted as signs that Mitchell Innovations was less successful than I had claimed. The fact that these appearances were misleading didn't change their impact on people who were evaluating my credibility based on visible markers of success. Food became an afterthought as stress killed my appetite and the constant anxiety made normal meals feel impossible. I survived on coffee and whatever simple items I could prepare quickly between phone calls and crisis management sessions. Sleep was fragmentary and unrefreshing, interrupted by racing thoughts about potential responses to the attacks and concerns about how much worse the situation might become. The worst aspect was the growing realization that David's strategy was working exactly as he had intended. By attacking my reputation rather than my actual work, he had created doubt that was almost impossible to dispel through conventional means. Even clients who were satisfied with our technical performance were being influenced by suggestions that maybe there was something inauthentic about my success, something that careful due diligence might reveal. The temptation to fight back aggressively was constant, but Robert's strategic thinking had emphasized the importance of responding from positions of strength rather than defensiveness. Revealing the full scope of my financial resources too early or in the wrong context could create different problems, potentially attracting unwanted attention from competitors, media sources, or regulatory agencies that might question how a small consulting firm had suddenly gained access to such substantial capital. Elena Rodriguez's guidance during our scheduled video conferences provided some psychological relief, but also emphasized the complexity of managing the transition from my current situation to full utilization of Robert's legacy. The resources were available, but accessing them required careful planning and gradual implementation that would avoid creating new vulnerabilities while addressing the immediate crisis. the daily reality remained grinding and stressful, despite the knowledge that relief was possible. Each morning brought new challenges to address, new rumors to counter, new relationships to repair. The contrast between my hidden resources and my visible struggles created a kind of cognitive dissonance that made every interaction feel layered with secrets and strategic considerations. Maria Santos requested a private meeting during the second week of the crisis, explaining that she needed to understand the company's long-term prospects before making personal career decisions. Her questions were direct and professional, but the subtext was clear. She was evaluating whether to stay with Mitchell Innovations or seek opportunities with organizations whose stability wasn't being questioned publicly. I found myself in the impossible position of trying to provide reassurance without revealing information that could solve all concerns immediately. Telling Maria about Robert's financial legacy would eliminate her worries about the company's future, but it would also create questions about why I wasn't utilizing those resources more visibly, and whether there were legal or ethical constraints that prevented me from accessing the wealth I claimed to control. The conversation ended with Maria agreeing to stay through the end of the quarter while monitoring how the situation developed, a diplomatic way of giving herself time to explore other options while maintaining professional courtesy. Her uncertainty was entirely rational, given the information available to her, but it still felt like another crack in the foundation I had spent years building. The pressure was building toward some kind of resolution that would either restore my reputation or force me to abandon everything I had worked to create. David's attacks had been successful enough that simply waiting for the controversy to fade was no longer a viable strategy. The business was contracting too quickly, and the reputational damage was spreading too widely to be contained through passive responses. Robert's strategic planning was about to prove its value, but the immediate reality remained a daily struggle to maintain composure while watching my professional world crumble around me. The knowledge that I had the means to end the crisis immediately made every day of continued struggle feel both necessary and almost unbearable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.